Tell me who you are, ma'am.
And I work for the Department of Administrative Services.
Thank you, ma'am. Oh, okay, very well. You two folks? Oh, thank you. All right. Well, thank you all for joining. I apologize that I have not been around, and Brian is capable, ability, capable whatever to take care of things. So you know what I'm going to do? You're in charge today,
Good.
as you have been the last month. So carry on.
So, I don't see a whole lot of folks in the audience who are probably looking to testify. I think we're winding down with the folks who have concerns. But obviously, if any of you are interested, we'll hear from you. The There's a few issues that we do need to address. And we will need at least one amendment, maybe just one covering all the issues. Something I was just talking to the Department of Labor about was the concern raised last week from the Department of Environmental Services. I found it a very legitimate concern over equipment that is manufactured overseas, does not meet the OSHA requirements. Expensive equipment. And to require someone to immediately and abruptly replace perfectly good equipment is not what we're after. So what we need to do is figure out a way to accommodate the Department of Environmental Services without opening the barn door wide open for anybody who wants an exception to line up and say, me too. So I think there's my last words to Mr. Gardner was we got to figure this out. So we got to figure that out. Another issue that we need to address is the effective date. I think in earlier conversations, we've concluded that 60 days is not a good idea. We do need to give people more time to get ready for this. And that's a discussion I'd like to have today to figure out, as we put an amendment together, what the actual effective date ought to be. We heard something about 5 years. That's too long. And again, understanding that the department is not, I think I said last week, the day this becomes effective, there's not going to be a starting gun go off, and everybody is going to have to be perfect on day one. The department will operate the way the department operates. They're not a gotcha operation. They're a let's figure this out together operation. And I think because of that, I'm not overly concerned with having everything perfect on day one. But 60 days isn't right. We got to figure out somewhere between 60 days and several years where we land. Several years is way too long. And do you want to talk about your thoughts on?
Yeah, whatever you're.
Yeah, I guess I'll ask the chairman to weigh in on something that he and I were discussing prior to the hearing today. So take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. I have had an opportunity to briefly discuss this with well, I probably haven't told you all the things that I've been doing. Let me back up. So knowing I was not going to be around for a few meetings, I did have an opportunity to have a relatively long conversation with Commissioner Merrifield and about this and about 1910. And, I admit I have not read all of 1910. And I don't want I don't ever want to get caught by saying, well, yeah, we passed something, but I didn't really read it all. So I have a copy here if anyone's really interested. And this, I don't know who did this, but Rudy Ogden provided us with a copy of 1910, and it has three different colors: red, blue, and green, for items that may not be applicable, things that could be applicable, and non-mandatory things. And I'm going to take it upon myself to read as much of this as I can, because I really want to be able to answer every question I can. If someone says to me in the committee, did anyone read this? Does anyone know what you're asking us to do here? But in the conversations that I had with the commissioner, admittedly, the department knows that they haven't kept up with some of the safety things as per, I think, current law, as say every 2 years or something right now. It was every year, and I think that was then changed, modified every 2 years, and then, things can happen and it doesn't get done. No harm, no foul. But trying to implement this entire law, it would be relatively impossible to hand a binder this thick. I know I'm old, so I actually, made a copy. I know all you young kids look at things in computers now, but my brain doesn't work that way from screen to screen. And one of the things that, could we break this down into implementing something different each of the next 3 years? I would not be an advocate for implementing anything, as you said, in 30 or 60 or 90 days, nor would I say we're going to pass this and nothing happens for 5 years, because you know what's going to happen. All of us know that 6 months before the 5th year, whatever day we do, everyone's going to
6 days.
Exactly. Everyone's going to do it the last week and then say they can't do it. Another thing that dawned on me, and I did not just speak with this, Ken, with the commissioner, and I don't think I've expressed it to anyone here. I don't think it's a bad idea, but I'm not sure everyone's going to like it. I don't like when we mandate, and there's have been some discussion about, is this an unfunded mandate to municipalities or to the departments within our state? We do know that there's a surplus every year that the Department of Labor turns back to the general fund. And in my mind, I thought, well, what's wrong with implementing as part of this law a 50-50 grant up to a maximum allotted amount of $500,000 per year that could be utilized as an application basis to the Department of Labor to help possibly mitigate some of the costs to the municipalities in the state departments of the state to purchase new things that they need to. There's certain machinery, certain equipment. So I'm throwing that out as an idea to be considered. I do not want an implementation of a long period down the road. I would like something where 1910 could be implemented in sections each year for the next 3 years as a way of easing in some of these things, to have it done with obvious exclusions for certain things. One of the things that these machines have, I don't know how sophisticated these things are, but if any of you have ever worked in a machine shop, you ever see one of these things where you have to have one hand here, and you push it with your foot? That way you can't get your hands caught in it. I don't know if it's that kind of a machine where that doesn't have those safety mechanisms or not. I don't know if you have any details on that, but I wouldn't want, if it was in the forensic laboratory of the state, I wouldn't want all of a sudden we put something in place where they can't do their jobs anymore because we're going to hear it. So overall, that was my thought. Now, how do we do this? We would have to work directly page by page with the department to determine which things can be implemented, the ones that are the least costly and most easily implemented the first year, and get increasingly more difficult to achieve complete 1910 by a certain period of time.
Is that something the department can, I know you're just hearing it now, but can you share any thoughts you might have on that idea of a graduated implementation, whether that makes it easier for folks or more difficult? Would it be better just to go with the concept of we're going to help you get caught up as this implementation happens, or is splitting up the standards into three sections, is that something that is feasible and workable?
Hmm?
Throw you right into the fire here.
So I think one of the potential concerns without, digging really into the 1910s is if there's any sort of references throughout, to other portions of 1910, other portions of the OSHA law. So, again, without digging in, it's kind of tough to say, but I think that'd be one of the concerns is how do we actually set this up so there isn't any confusion there of, okay, this has a reference to subpart S in this one that we've implemented, but we haven't implemented subpart at actually work. What are the employers actually subject to? So I think off the top of my head, that would be one of the primary concerns, which is something that obviously we would have to figure out of the feasibility of that. Because again, I do know that there are references throughout the OSHA laws to other subparts, to other sections of the law in general.
It occurs to me as well that what this bill does is it repeals the Department of Labor safety standards and implements the OSHA 1910. If you repeal the Department of Labor standards and only implement 1/3 of the OSHA standards, the gaps that exist now get a lot bigger because you're going to have entire sections that aren't have no safety standards.
Yes, and to that point, there may inevitably be holes, as you're stating, that, all the safety standards are repealed, and if we are not wholesale adopting 1910, if we're doing it piecemeal, there might be sections that, if we don't do scaffolding during the first go-around and the scaffolding portion is repealed, there may be no standards of scaffolding, which I think kind of goes against the intent of the bill to make more robust standards.
Why would you want to pass a law that wipes out what's being done now?
Because it's being replaced. There are scaffolding standards in OSHA. There are scaffolding standards in the Department of Labor
Correct.
safety
Yes.
standards. But unless you, then this may make it overly complicated. You would have to leave. You would have to do a partial repeal and a partial implementation, matching up the parts that you're repealing and the parts that you're implementing over that 3-year period. Is it just me, or does that make it overly complicated for the department?
It has the potential to. I think again the real key piece there is how they interact with each other. So each implementation would require some fairly in-depth analysis, I would imagine, as to determining again how they're going to interact with each other, what the employers are actually going to be subject to. And again, I understand the intent of the bill, or at least one of the intents of the initial bill, was to kind of clean things up and put it more out there so the employers are aware of what's going on. So I know that the last thing any of us wants to do is make it more confusing for employers as to what their requirements are under the law.
You're running the
One of the things that's coming back to my mind in this conversation, and it's something that I don't think I did justice in trying to explain to our chairman when I was talking with them. Can we go back and revisit the conversation that we had last week regarding the training and the idea of training? Some of the concerns that were brought here last week had to do with the additional costs needed for training. And if we even do this in segments, there is going to have to be a training. I foresee some training. And you were talking about the idea that some of the tradesmen who are licensed could potentially be the trainers of the OSHA standards. Am I understanding that correctly? I was trying
So
to
yeah,
explain
I
it.
think if I recall correctly, what the concerns from some of the stakeholders were born out of was the fact that the training requirements under OSHA might be a little bit more stringent. And what the discussion centered on, and if I remember correctly, and it might not have been eloquently testified to, and I do apologize if that's true, was that tradesmen may be qualified to train. That's not a prima facie case that 100% say it's a plumbing, plumbing that they're training in, that if they hold a master plumber's license, it's still a case by case basis. But I know that the concerns again did center on we might have to outsource some more training, which will be cost, to the municipalities, and they weren't entirely sure what that training would look like or who would be considered qualified, because while there is a qualified person standard, it is rather broad under OSHA. And to be honest with you, I'm not entirely sure how OSHA interprets that. But again, as far as tradesmen's go, it would be one of the pieces of analysis, and it would be a case by case basis on if they are deemed qualified. Pardon me, but is there more to the question? Kind of, I might have misunderstood where I'm going with this.
No, but there isn't. I appreciate the qualifying on that, because last week you did leave me a little bit distressed over the idea, having been a professional in the trades, knowing that just because somebody is licensed in the trades does not mean that they are qualified to teach OSHA
Of course,
standards.
yeah, and I apologize if
And,
that wasn't
I walked
clear.
away with that saying, if I gave that to 5 of my service technicians, maybe one of them could come out getting some of it right, but
Yeah,
the other 4 would not.
Of course, of course. When I was licensed as an attorney day one, that doesn't mean I'm qualified to train as an attorney.
So you left me with that one hanging.
I
saying,
apologize
how in
for
the world
that.
does he possibly think a licensed gas fitter could be
Again,
qualified to train OSHA?
it would be a piece of the analysis, but again, it's not necessarily that, okay, they have this license, that's all we need. We would still have to vet that and see, if they do meet the qualified person standard.
I think one of the obvious pieces is that you could be one heck of an electrician, a really good electrician, totally incapable of training anyone else.
Correct.
And look at the safety numbers within the companies that are OSHA, they have incidences, and these guys are all trained.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. During our talks with Deputy Commissioner Ogden, and we have a new gentleman here with us today, if there was no standard in the DOL log, there was always reference to a general duties clause. And where would you reference that back to? Do you use the OSHA?
No,
1910? What do you, because there was a lot of talk about going to general duties and then looking for an industry standard, then going to looking for OSHA, what
I
OSHA
think
says.
there's a misunderstanding there. So when it comes to the general duties can be found under RSA 281A 64, where it just basically says all employers, private or public, have the obligation to provide a safe working environment. And then it lists a bunch of things that they should be considering and doing, like providing PPE where necessary. So we would go in under current standards, we would go in and do a safety inspection with our safety inspectors. And if there's not something specifically enumerated within the 1400 lab rules, but we identify a dangerous condition. So there's a sinkhole in the middle of their parking lot that doesn't have guarding around it. I think that might even be, that's already in there. Well, yeah, it's a sinkhole, so it's not, doesn't fall under a confined space, but they need to address it. We would look at it under 277, I think it's 17 and 18. So those give us the jurisdiction over on a public employer for an additional safeguard or a modification to an already existing safety program or plan. Now, when we look at that, most of the time it is not OSHA standards that we're looking at. It's usually some sort of common sense thing that had been overlooked. You see a sinkhole, you need to address it. If there's a suspicion of mold growing, you need to test it to figure out whether or not it's mold before you address it, because you can be addressing something incorrectly or unnecessarily. And so those are things that are not typically under OSHA. It's more of a common sense assessment of, how to adopt a safety standard. Like for example, we had one in which there was a loader that we were investigating a serious bodily injury where it was reversing and it hit and rolled over the foot of the spotter who's doing the directionals. And when we actually did the investigation, what we found out was there was a training gap. He did the directional signal for reverse when he meant stop, when he was doing hand signals. And this had been something that had been going on for a while between the supervisor and the employee, where they just weren't communicating well between the two of them. One had recognized a training gap, but it hadn't been addressed. So when we identified that, we added an additional safety standard of you need to complete a training with this individual with respect to proper hand signals for directionals before he conducts this activity again in the future. And then is this addressed in your safety program with respect to training? When should he have gotten this training? What did the training look like? And if he wasn't adhering to it, what are your steps to include potentially discipline? So those are things that are typically under the modification and these additional safeguards. Now, if it's something that's completely outside we've never seen before, which again rarely happens, we may look to OSHA for guidance, but that does not happen very often.
Yep.
So who sets the training standards? Where would you look for that? The state, if the state didn't have something in that area, where would you look to find those training standards in order to pass on to the municipality that you would be investigating?
So the training standards, so there are commonly used directional signals for that. We would talk to the employer and say, what are your directionals? How do you train them for them? And so it's the employer who would be stating, and this isn't in OSHA either, but it would be something in which the employer would state, we adopted these directionals. These are the signals that we utilize. And we're like, okay, how are you communicating that to your employee? How are you training? And then how are you supervising to make sure they're actually adhering to it so that everyone's on the same page and these accidents do not happen again?
Good. Is that?
Easy follow-up? That's okay.
Yep. No, keep going.
So, but there needs to be some type of go-to when the state does not have an industry standard or a standard within the DOL. What is to say that we cannot do the easy stuff first without having a law that mandate you guys to bring your standards up into at least the 2000s or 2010 standards or something like that into current standards, because we have building codes that are current, we have electrical codes that are current, we have food safety codes that are current. Why do we not have workers' safety codes that are current? And OSHA standards may not be is top tier. Why are we not even approaching mid-tier when it comes to some of the safety standards?
Well, I'm not saying we weren't approaching top or mid-tier. It's, these are instances in which would not have been addressed by OSHA either. Proper training, and, I guess, OSHA would say you have to utilize proper training. There's something in there too, but our standards say the same thing. So I don't think I follow.
So the easy ones, some of the easy ones, like not using a metal ladder when you're working on electricity. I mean, some of that stuff is common sense. OSHA says you have to use a certain type of ladder, certain type of foot soles, certain type of equipment, insulated equipment when you're working on live electrical lines. If our standards, current standards right now do not address that, and somebody is injured during working on one of the bridge projects or lighting project, where would the inspector go to find those standards to say, this is what you should be doing, which is the correct procedures? Even though we don't have those particular, stringent standards, we can at least get you part way to being more safe for your employees.
It would just be the additional safeguards in the sense that you shouldn't be operating, around electricity without utilizing proper safety gear, to include not a metal ladder.
But where would you find those standards? Where would you go to if the state doesn't have those written in your logs or your 1400?
I have something somewhere on that already. So utilize, OSHA could be a standard that we utilize, but we also look at the actual, if you have to operate all equipment as it is designed to be operated. And a lot of the equipment would say, do not operate around live wires. So that would also be where that's one of the standards that we have in our laws, is that operate equipment as it's directed.
I guess what we're what we're talking about is the reason why we're doing this. We are trying to expand and provide more complete safety standards. The difficulty is that OSHA included does not have everything. No standard will provide for every safety issue under the sun. You're talking about sinkholes. Sinkholes are a problem, but does any safety standard address sinkholes? Probably not. So the general duties clause is going to continue to be necessary so that common sense safety can be observed. But that doesn't mean this effort is not needed. We do need more complete safety standards, and this bill provides for that. So I guess that's why we're doing this.
And that's not the position of the department. We take no position with respect to any laws that you draft
Right.
and adopt. I just want to state that we do address these issues.
I guess I'm thinking that there are some issues that we need to address, and I'm wondering if we ought to be addressing them offline to some degree. We need to figure out the DES exception issue. We need to figure out whether graduated implementation is feasible and advisable, because I can see the potential for it becoming more complicated and more confusing, and people don't know. We have bigger gaps in our safety standards, and no one knows exactly what standards we're using because part of it's in, part of it's not. So we need to figure that out, and I think we need to have some probably some in-depth conversations with the department on the cost sharing concept. I suspect that might be a something that kind of goes to the top. You guys aren't authorized to spend money, are you?
No. That goes to the top house, yes.
Right. So I guess I entertain thoughts from the rest of the committee here as to how we might do that. One possibility is that the Representative Infantine and myself could meet with the department to try to work these things out, aside from an actual hearing. It would be just the two of us trying to come up with something that we would then bring back to the subcommittee, and eventually, before too long, we need to vote this bill out of the subcommittee and send it on to a executive session. But I think we've thrown some things up in the air that need to be resolved before we can do that. Do you have thoughts on that?
Overall, my thoughts are that we currently have a law which requires the Department of Labor to update their safety standards on a whatever regular basis that is. For reasons that things happen, it hasn't been done. I am not going to be critical of the Department of Labor because overall I think they do an extremely good job here in the state of New Hampshire. But the fact is, I don't want to put a law in place that is so voluminous that they're not adhering to the law now, and then we put something so big in that it's still not going to be. I mean, I would really like to know some of the details. All of a sudden, the legislature passes 1910 as is. What is the Department of Labor going to do? How many employees do they have to hire? Who's going to be in charge of this? Who's going to know this thing left and right? How much is going to be implemented? What about the training that's going to have to be done by the DOL to allow members of their own department to come in and do these things? And I'd rather have a much more neat plan, more clear and concise plan, so we know exactly what it is. Now, the department's, very good. Their standard answer, like many of the other departments, are, we will do what the law requires us to do. They're not legislators and we're not administrators. But I just want to make sure that we are not in a situation where we implement something where the department's not prepared to enforce, and we're having municipalities and departments of the state having to spend a bunch of money to get up to a certain standard, when no one at the Department of Labor really knows that standard yet, because someone's got to spend 6 months studying it and figuring it out. It just doesn't happen overnight where we pass something and they know this, correct? I mean, no one's going to memorize this overnight. So I want to make sure what we're putting in place is actually going to be adhered to and rolled out correctly. And we get up to a better standard where we are today. Now, that sounds good. I don't know how to do that, Brian.
That's not our job. That's your job. And so I guess I would be delighted to hear some thoughts from you as to what the department would need to do or put in place in order for this implementation, and when the time frame. Your input on the effective date would be helpful as well, and a fair answer would be, we're not sure. We have to figure that out. And my objective is not to put you on the spot and say we want an answer now to every question. But do you have any thoughts on I think what the chairman is indicating is fair, that basically we want a clean implementation. What does the department need in order to provide a clean implementation?
So initially, I would say, of course, we would need time as well. To your point, Representative, I'm not sure what the time frame really would be at the end of the day, but our current safety inspectors are trained on our safety laws, and they're trained on how to research other safety laws, but they are not trained on OSHA. So obviously, any of our safety inspectors, any of our administrative staff that handles this stuff, would have to, spend some time learning the OSHA laws, training on those. To be honest with you, I'm not entirely sure what that looks like. As we talked about previously, I think that we would, at a minimum, even if we're doing piecemeal implementation, we would need some more staff. One of the big pieces would be the consultation program that is required by an OSHA state plan. I know, obviously, we talked about we're not going to an OSHA state plan, but inevitably we would expect to see a lot of the stakeholders be proactive and reach out saying, hey, I know that this is coming. We want to make sure that we're good, which obviously we all want that. So again, our safety inspectors already have their own caseload as is. This would add to that, and it would, again, add to the consultancy piece in the sense that we would expect some sort of a floodgate to open where these stakeholders would be seeking some input from us. They would be seeking, much like we're doing with the Department of Environmental Services currently, of going out there, determining where they're at relative to the current standards, where they're going to be at relative to the new standards, and what that would take. So, in short, as you did state, Representative, a lot of this is difficult to determine on the spot right now. It's something, of course, we can work towards, determining with our commissioner and deputy commissioner and our safety inspectors. But to the question relative to time frame, the department itself would need some time as far as implementation goes. Of course, as we've heard from the stakeholders and everyone's aware, they would need some time for implementation as well.
And I guess what we're asking, not at the moment, but we need to know what that time frame is. And I think we need to ask for the department to develop a plan for implementation that we can make sure that this bill is properly amended so that the department can provide for that clean implementation that I was talking about. And I guess my question is, how soon can we have that from you? Because we need to move forward with this. We retained it so we could do this. So, and I, for one, would be happy to come in and meet with members of the department to work on it. And I know my friend is pretty busy, but would you be willing as well? I think that might be a good way to go forward, short term, but we don't have months to get this done. We have days. Um, what would be a good plan for us to come and meet with you folks?
Sullivan,
so-
even if it's just, excuse me, even if it's just I'm not expecting book, chapter, and verse, but even an outline.
Yeah.
Bullet pointed outline. You guys can work on the details yourself, giving us a time, because it'll give us the time frame which you need
For
to
an amendment.
determine some kind of implementation. Because, you know, as simple as, okay, this thing gets passed, let's say it gets signed by the governor in June of 2024. It's going to take 2 or 3 months for the department to budget, determine what additional staff they need, get them hired, get them on board, get them trained before you can then start having educational things. So kind of that is more of a timeline what I'm looking for. It doesn't have to be exact to the date. More general bullet points and subsections than a complete written epistle that you probably have to send over, you know, possibly to Jalcar or something.
So I think that's something obviously the department can work on and get that to you as soon as we can. And of course, we're more than welcome to any of the representatives coming in to work with us on it, have any questions or concerns. Obviously, we're always available. I would say one piece of that being the timeline would inevitably be different, and we can work on both timelines and an estimate to that. But obviously, as you know, the concern being might take longer. What I'm getting at is whether we're doing piecemeal, as we've potentially discussed, if we're doing the wholesale adoption. The long and short being the mechanisms of what we're actually doing here would, of course, impact what it would take for us to implement it. And again, we can work on varying kind of proposals. And again, of course, they'd be broad. But again, inevitably, that would take more time because we'd have to do several different analyses there.
You had mentioned briefly in your testimony that your inspectors are trained under your either general duties or other mechanisms and not OSHA.
Correct.
And part of the I don't know who did this, but part of the I don't know what I'm trying to say here. Part of what was done with 1910 was someone made a decision to look through every single line and determine what you're doing, what you're not doing, what may not be applicable.
Correct.
So my point is, I'm trying to make is, how different are they? Do you have any, I mean, it just.
So I can tell you,
between the general
Representative, I was
conditions
the
and
one who
OSHA.
actually did that. It's been several years at this
Well,
point.
thank you very much.
But as you probably note, even just kind of going through it broadly, but once you're going through it a little bit more with a fine tooth comb, a lot of the provisions, we simply have nothing. So it's completely absent from our laws. Again, these are pieces that, as Director Rojas has testified to, that our inspectors are trained to recognize of like an obvious safety issue. So, it's something that they might go to OSHA, they might go to just the general standards of the equipment, whatever it may be. But for them to be experts, to be going out to these locations, of course, they don't need to know word by word everything, but they need to have a general sense to say, okay, I know that the OSHA standard that we're using now under the 1910s actually delineates specific, inches or feet or, whatever it may be for, say, the space between rungs on ladders. That might be something we don't have. So it's something that they would need to be trained on, again, not to the minutia by any means, but to be able to recognize that it's like, okay, this on its face looks like it might not comply. I need to take a look at this standard. I need to measure this. So that's where, to your overall point, the issue being that a lot of these pieces are completely absent from our laws. It's not merely, in a lot of cases, of we're adding more safeguards, more standards to something that's already there. Obviously, scaffolding is something that we have in our rules and our law. That would be a little bit more robust. So it's something that they're already trained on, at least to a point. So it would be in addition to that. But again, a lot of this stuff will be under the 1910s. Items that are completely new to our laws.
Do
And I
you,
just wanted to address So it's not just general duties, it's chapter lab 277, 277A, lab rule 600 and the 1400. So it's, our inspectors are well versed in a number of statutes. I just wanted to make sure that they weren't getting short shrifted and that they know of one statute. They, they're pretty knowledgeable and it does provide a level of protection, but I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, my impression, I'm aware, I think we are aware that there's more than just the general duties clause. Everything doesn't come under that, but I would say too much stuff does come under that. And my observation, and see if this is, if you agree, the where there is a Department of Labor standard and an OSHA standard, they don't generally conflict with each other. They might look different. They might be worded differently, and in many cases, the OSHA standard is more robust, more detailed. But as I read through and did comparisons of the two, I didn't see conflicts. I don't think there's going to be something that would be deemed safe under the Department of Labor standards and suddenly unsafe under OSHA standards.
That's the exception being what we just identified with the environmental services.
Yes, yes.
Didn't hear you, I'm
That
sorry.
was the exception is the environmental services concern that we would be addressing.
Right. Yes. Yes. The equipment that is made overseas and therefore not working for us. So, but that's something we need to figure out. Do you have an idea when would be good for Representative Infantine and myself to come meet with the department? I mean, you need some time to
Well, I'd say both Director Rojas and myself can make ourselves available generally whenever works for the both of you. We would have to speak to, Commissioner Merrifield and Deputy Commissioner Albert, as I would imagine that they would want to be involved as well too. But of course, they generally, obviously they're busy, but they do try to be available as well. So to the question off the top of our head, there's no specific dates or times that we could propose at this time, but it's something that I think we can put together in very short order that works for everybody.
how about you go back to the department and let us know when would be a good time? And I think I just heard you say Deputy Commissioner Albert.
Yes, she has ascended to the deputy commissionership. Well
right,
deserved.
For anybody who doesn't know, Deputy Commissioner Ogden is now in the governor's office and gone from the Department of Labor. So he will be missed. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It sounds like you want to have an advisory committee for implementation of the OSHA standards. Could that be part of this bill going forward?
Could be.
And also, could we have a permanent subcommittee, or if in addition to, or if we don't do the advisory committee, could we have a permanent subcommittee so we can have quarterly meetings or quarterly updates on what is being done after we pass this law?
Certainly possible.
And one final
Yep.
update, would you mind? Looking through some of this, and we've looked through it for years now, and I want to thank this gentleman here for working on that. If there was an implementation over time, could the easy stuff be done first, and then the medium stuff a year later, and then the hard stuff be worked on through the entire things that have the tentacles that go out into other industries to handle that, like not using an aluminum ladder at electrical if it's not in our standards. I mean, the easy stuff that we could.
I think again the potential difficulty without delving into the minutia of the 1910s is where there's cross references, pieces like that. I would say the other piece, which is I guess would be for all of us to determine, like what constitutes the easy ones, what constitutes which I think would go back to cost at the end of the day more than likely in implementation. But perhaps that probably requires a little bit more input from the stakeholders, because again, until, the good example is the environmental services. Until they brought that up, it's not something that I think the department nor the committee new would be such a large project and a large cost to implement. So to your question, I mean, I think it's definitely possible on its face, but you know that answer could change in the future the more that we actually look into what the mechanisms and procedure of that would really be at the end of the day. But you know, I think if it can work, it could be a good idea in the sense that it allows to kind of piecemeal and slow walk this thing while updating the standards. And again, that's something that we'll take the time to look into as much as we can, you know, given our time constraints of what that actually might entail on our end. And again, the other caveat being, it might be difficult if we're identifying what's, you know, easy, difficult, you know, and we're kind of, you know, figuring out what's that. Are those actually, you know, contained within, is if we say subpart D, is all of subpart D easy? Or are there pieces of that 90% of it is very easy implementation, but there's the 10% that's going to cause this large cost to DES? I'm not sure about that, so it's kind of hard to say on its face again. So it's another concern and consideration I think we would all have to have. And at the end of the day, I think we all want this to be as streamlined and simplified for everybody. And I would worry and have concerns if we are adopting portions of subparts piecemeal, how difficult that might be then to implement and understand by the stakeholders. But again, that's something that we'd have to work through and look into a little bit more in depth, I would say.
So even just identifying what PPE is, if I can go to 277 and look and see, okay, well, PPE requires a mask of a certain standard, or gloves of a certain standard, or your hand gloves for, you know, identifying something needs to be a certain mil per. I mean, that kind of stuff is not in there, and I know it's probably in 1910. Could we slow walk that to saying, okay, well, you have to have gloves, but this is the standard that we would be looking for now, or this is the standard that we would be looking for in 3 years, or this is the changes that we need to implement to make sure that it happens, or instead of a 3-point harness, you now need a 4-point harness to hang off a bridge or something like that. I mean, stuff that
Again,
we
yeah,
could-
I think
that would
it's
be easy for somebody like me that reads it,
of course.
and then, you know, you guys have the, you know,
Again, I think that's definitely possible. And again, the concern that I think that we would have is just in the sense of if we're taking piecemeal from each part of this, you know, if we're just taking full subparts, it's relatively easy, I would say, of now we're doing subparts D through F, and now we're doing G through J, whatever it may be. But once we start taking, okay, now we're doing these provisions from subpart C, but we're holding off on these other provisions from subpart C, it could just become more of a project. Not that, you know, we're, you know, afraid of hard work by any means, but again, I think that one of the intents of this bill was to get the standards, one, get them more robust, but get them more out there. And I think that was kind of your line of questioning earlier of we want these stakeholders to actually know what these standards are and what the department's going to be going towards. So again, it just might be a little bit more difficult. And again, this is just me kind of spitballing on it. You know, I'm not without actually delving into it. But if we are taking piecemeal from each subpart, the further we delve down, the kind of more difficult it does get a little bit in the sense that, okay, now we have to remember in 4 months, we have to go back to subpart C and reevaluate. These are the pieces we're missing from subpart C that we haven't implemented yet. Are these easy that we want to implement now? Are they a little bit more difficult? So that's the only concern that I would have in that sense, if that makes sense.
And I guess the other concern that I continue to have is that when this bill is signed into law, when it becomes effective, all of the current safety standards go away, and we have to make sure that we don't leave a vacuum with no standards covering vast sections of the public sector workforce. And I'm wondering if, rather than picking and choosing which standards to implement, perhaps there can be some language added into an amendment that would impact the implementation process. In other words, how will the department be viewing employers who are new to the OSHA standards? Can we put and again, you don't want to say that we're going to give everybody a pass because you don't do that now. But is there something we can do in order to give employers a grace period of some sort?
So I can address how we do it currently.
Okay.
So right now, if we come to a location and they have just passed their budget and they didn't raise any of the safety concerns that we recognized during our inspection, we look at it and we triage what needs to be done immediately. What are the hurdles? And then we babysit the case to make sure it's all done within a reasonable amount of time. So, for example, there was an elevator that needed to be fixed, but because of the current economy, the piece that needed to be made by special order wasn't going to be ready for 6 months. Well, is the elevator able to be safely maintained or operated until then? No. Okay, we're going to suspend that unit. Adopt new safety standards in the meantime. Do you have an additional elevator? Yes. Great. And then, so that so we wait and, but we're babysitting. We don't close that case. There was another instance in which a boiler was being improperly maintained. Well, we had allocated this amount of money for an ice cream, county ice cream, it was a town, I think it was going to put a little ice cream stand. So, well, does that take precedence over the boiler, in which could go boom? No. So they were able to reallocate the funds for the ice cream. So nobody got ice cream this past summer, sorry. But they got a new boiler for that location. So so we were able to discuss what needs to be done immediately and then create a reasonable timeline for the other things to get done. We're not talking years, we're talking months. And then it's monitored by an inspector. So this would cost, if we do have additional, new standards, there's going to be a lot more cases to babysit. This is where our staffing needs are going to become stretched thin, though.
And I think that was part of our discussion in the last couple sessions here, that I've said it over and over again, the department is not a punitive department. It's a department that helps people get it together. So perhaps, I'm going to suggest this and see where it goes, but perhaps it's better to just adopt all the standards all at once, with the emphasis that the department will continue operating the way it does, helping people to learn the new standards and the new adjustments they need to make, and as you said, babysit the issue to make sure that people come along. That way we don't have any gaps in standards, no confusion as to which standards are in place and which ones aren't. They're all in place, but we're not going to whack you over the head with it. We're going to help you get in line. I guess I throw that to the committee. What do we think?
What do I think? I'm not sure I really want to go on the record as passing a piece of legislation, knowing full well I don't expect the Department of Labor to enforce it the way it's been written.
But they're simply continuing to operate the way they operate. Right now, if someone's unaware of the current standards, they don't necessarily get the book thrown at them. True?
So we are operating as the law is designed. The law requires us to be reasonable. So, there is a reasonable standard. So there is there's a shutdown provision if safety standards are not being met such that there is danger of life and limb. We are that's not the first go-to. There are punitive measures that can be implemented. That's not our first go-to. We don't assess civil penalties. This is, the safety unit is not a money generator at all. We're not, so it's something in which we use if we need to escalate, but rarely do we have an employer who is doing this intentionally. We're education forward, and we've noticed that most of the violations that we see are just due to ignorance, with good intentions but ignorance. So we are, so it's just education, figuring out how fast it can be implemented. For instance, if they're missing an eye wash station, that can be done very quickly. If they ask for a 30-day extension, that's a no. But if they're asking for a piece that needs to be specially made in China, and that's we're going to be reasonable and understanding of when that's going to be accommodated, but we're going to make sure that that condition that's currently being, that exists isn't endangering anyone in the meantime.
So I guess the point is that we would not be passing a law that gives the department a pass on not enforcing. You will be enforcing, but you will enforce the way you enforce now. That you will be helping people to come into compliance. So I guess it seems to work better that way than to be slow walking the which standards are being implemented when. That seems like an overly complicated process.
Either way, we'd be implementing it the same.
Right.
Mr. Chairman, the one thing I seem to continue to be confused on here is why the bill has to be written where it removes all of something and implements something else. Why can't the existing law about general duties 281, 277, 1718, 600, 1400 still be in place they're utilizing, and then implement complete sections of certain parts of 1910, like the ladders is one of them you keep mentioning. There's a whole 25 pages about ladders. And then there's something about chains, hoisting chains, about the certain size they have to be. So did I miss something? Or is this just kind of the thought process where you take what you got now, move it aside, implement all of 1910? Why can't you keep what you have, implement certain sections of 1910 in their entirety?
I would suggest that would be confusing because essentially employers would have to figure out which sections are OSHA and which sections are under the old statute. And it would be very difficult for them to keep track of that. And frankly, I asked for some help with the deputy commissioner in drafting the bill. And it was his thought that the cleanest thing to do is repeal the whole, all of the DOL standards and replace them all at once so no one is confused as to what the standard is.
So the thought is that with what's being used now and implementing complete sections of 1910, that there's conflict, inconsistency?
Well, I mean, as we look through the side by side that Attorney Gardner put together for us, you wouldn't want to have an OSHA piece and a DOL piece. They're similar. They probably are not in conflict with each other, but they might be in small ways. And again, that would be incredibly confusing to say we're going to keep the old standard and the new standard at the same time, because you'd be covering the same standards in two different ways in many instances. In many instances, as Attorney Gardner pointed out, there is no standard in the current DOL, and I mean, frankly, filling in those gaps is what we're trying to do. And getting that done sooner rather than later, I think, is a good thing. And having the department helping employers learn and understand where these new standards are taking place, I think, I mean, a lot of these standards don't, depending on what kind of employer you are, a lot of the standards don't mean anything to certain employers. They don't, I mean, in the schools, they don't use ladders a lot. So although the custodians do. But in terms of most departments within the school don't have to worry about a lot of these standards. Only the maintenance department, perhaps. So I find the idea of implementing it in pieces to be incredibly confusing and difficult.
I'll give you an example. I'm just reading this, and again, I'm reading some of the stuff for the first time in depth. Do we know the entire 1910 period 142 temporary labor camps? There's 8 pages on temporary labor camps. I'm not sure whether that's a really important thing to be implemented right now for our municipalities to have.
But if it is implemented, it won't matter because there are no temporary labor camps. So
So then I got to read all the other stuff. This is what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid of someone going out and hiring someone. Said, okay, 1910 is the law. City of Manchester goes out and is going to hire someone at a cost of about all in $125,000 a year, okay, to study and implement 1910, and they're going to put rules together for I don't know, ladders, labor camps, chain couplings, how they're supposed to be done, and all these other things, and then if someone's actually following what we're telling them to do, if we implement a law, the cost associated with some of these things, and again, I'm remiss for not having read these 1,000 pages, which I guess I'm gonna have to start reading, but I don't know. I'm not trying to dumb it down. I just want to implement things that are. So when I took my OSHA 10, right, the things that I was taught basically were fall safety, trenching, heights. Those are the 3 big ones that seem to cause most of the injuries. And I want to hit the things that are probably the ones that are most important. And that was the only thing I was trying to do, Brian, not try to do anything halfway or to do it, but implementing some things that, I'm not sure they're going to enforce much on labor camps and
Well,
ladders,
and,
but
and I think what each employer will do is they'll go through and they'll say, this doesn't apply to us, this doesn't apply to us, this doesn't apply to us, these do. And they'll focus on the pieces that do and ignore the ones that have nothing to do with them. That'll be, different for the different types of employers. And a lot of public sector workers like firefighters have got standards above and beyond and aside from OSHA that they adhere to, and so that I think the employers and I don't think it falls on us to memorize the 1,000 pages. That's not going to be my objective here. Being somewhat aware of how they align, and again, the work of Attorney Gardner is very helpful here. But I don't think this is as difficult as we're making it out to be. There will be a lot of standards that don't apply to any public sector employers. There will be, depending on what kind of employer they are, they'll focus on the standards that are relevant. And that's, if the consultants that the Department of Labor hires, they'll be hiring people that probably have gone through the Keene State program, which is the OSHA training center for New Hampshire. But
as you know, Mr. Chairman, I'm always cognizant about passing a bill out of the House that we can get signed by the governor into law. And I'm concerned that if we pass this and we go to a Senate hearing, we have too many kind of, maybe the ball's in the air with what we're trying to tell them that we want them to do.
Well, and I
That's
guess,
the only reason
I guess what I'm looking to is let's get the Department of Labor to help us with the details on that. I don't know if it would help if we met with you before you implement come up with that plan, or whether it's in which case probably early next week would be a good time to get together. And then, and maybe what we ought to do is, take it, give it 2 weeks, talk to you early next week, and then the following week, have an outline so that when we do go to the Senate, I agree, we need to be able to say, this is how this thing is going to be rolled out. But I guess rather than us trying to micromanage this, I don't think that is our role. That's your role. We're going to ask you to micromanage it and figure out the cleanest way to roll this thing out. What is the best effective date? If there's any reason to have multiple effective dates where certain aspects of this are done, we'd like to hear about that. What are we going to do about the DES concerns? We need to have a discussion with the commissioner about the prospect of a 50-50 cost sharing for employers, and just I guess we're looking to you the best way to roll this out, and we want to go to the Senate with a plan that says this is doable, this is worthwhile. This is going to, make our workplaces more safe. We heard some last week about how, the slips and falls and those types of things are the most common types of workplace injuries. I don't think we're trying to address the most common ones. We're trying to address the most serious ones. And having more complete safety standards will make sure that the serious injuries and the fatalities on the job, they're not common now. We want to make them far less common, non-existent if possible. That's the objective of doing this. Yep,
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
please.
I guess I'm sitting here wondering, there's a couple of things that are going through my head as we're discussing this, but if there's things within the 1910 that don't apply, and we are throwing out a broad net of safety standards that may or may not be followed or may or may not be read or known by half the people or half of the public entities, I guess I wonder what the value is in that. And the other thing that I guess I would like to share is something that I experienced yesterday with road paving in our town with the state DOT. And when I experienced this, my first thought came right back to the subcommittee and the discussions that we're having and who's in charge of what and what safety protocols are followed. So I'm driving up the road and they're paving on my lane. So the flagger directs me to the other lane to go around it. And as I'm going up and around it, the other flagger is alongside the road, and it's a narrow road, talking with other DOT or other employees of Continental Paving, I'm not sure, but they're occupying a space in my lane. So now I'm forced to cross back into where they're paving, where the equipment is. So I'm sitting there saying, why are these guys standing where they're standing in the road? Because that's just an accident waiting to happen. And now they're forcing me to drive on tar that hasn't been put down, and I'm getting it all splattered over my car, and I'm in now the travel lane of the paving guy. So I immediately thought back to our safety standards. Who's following what? And here we have private sector and public sector working side by side on a job. Who's following what? And the flagger could get hit. Those employees could have gotten hit. If I had my phone in my hand and was not paying attention, somebody could have gotten hit.
And part of what brings us here is when Tom Wooten was killed some years ago on a public sector job. And that's part of the inspiration for being here. So I agree with you.
Excuse me, Representative Capone.
I had,
Where was that location?
no. Nice try.
But that's, but that's why we're here, is to make people safe. And so,
not why you're here today.
okay.
I'm using that as an example. It's a valid example.
We had talked about, I had mentioned implementing certain parts of it, and you'd rather go with the full thing, but then you also full 1910, but then you wanted to exclude certain things. right? You wanted some, especially this one where this machine is made overseas. So I'm okay with one. I find them both, I find the same thing and it's saying it's said a different way. If you want to implement all of 19 and exclude them things, or just to implement part of 1910, it doesn't matter to me either way. But as long as there's the ability, which you seem amenable to certain things that may not be either feasible right now or too costly right now.
And I guess that's something that we may need to work out exactly how to word that. But we were talking prior to the meeting today of possibly having some form of temporary grandfathering that allows the DES, for example, to continue using their very expensive, effective, and non-compliant equipment for a period of time. It'll have to be replaced eventually anyways. So when it's replaced, it should be replaced with something that is compliant. But doing something like that, I think works. But I don't think the partial implementation of the standards is going to work. That's going to cause confusion. But basically, where there is a problem, and if we can come up with a general provision for temporary grandfathering, maybe that would work. But and have the department authorized to figure out where that fits and where it doesn't. And I guess I'm going to ask you to think about that. And when we do get together, perhaps that's something that we can try to work on. So,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a fan of the slow walk. I'm not a fan of dropping all of it. I know we've been in discussions for over a year. The department knows the direction we want to go. Coming from an area with very small towns, anything we implement within the next 2 or 3 years is going to take them 2 or 3 years through the budget cycles, or we need to get this new trash compactor that has, the two-hand thing on it, you operate by your foot. I mean, stuff like that. So I'm happy to be part of this, but we have to be aware that the smaller towns that only have a few employees that have to go to town meeting and town budget and work this out and get the funding for it and raise the taxes for it, that we give them the ability to do that without having open cases for years of these towns. So we have to have extended government oversight into these areas. I mean, I like a three-year idea of easy, hard, medium, and hard. I mean, if we have to grant exceptions, we should be able to pivot that and have the department grant exceptions or grandfathers or extensions or anything like that. So we have the ability to be flexible. And through the time, we've always wanted to do it the New Hampshire way. We don't want to come in and have the heavy-handed of OSHA on the backs of the public employers, or have the fines or have the things with the plan that we were talking about and all that other stuff. I mean, we want to do it our way. We should be able to let the department do it their way, and we should be able to, not hold their hand, but, say, hey, we want to see something change. And I think it's been made clear through the last year we've been talking about this, that this is coming one way or another. Let's do it together.
Yep. And I guess the temporary grandfathering is something that would, I think, do what you're looking for, if I'm not mistaken, that essentially it would allow an employer to say, look, we realize that there's a standard here that is implemented as of June 1st, 2025, let's say. But we need time to make the adjustment that grandfathering could occur, but it would have to, you'd have to say it can only go on if, for a 3-year period or something like that. And then they would have to make the adjustment, but it would give them time to budget, give them time to plan, and get ready, basically. But they would understand, and that might be the piece. So I guess I'm going to ask you folks to think about that idea, and when we start crafting an amendment, that's something that I think if we could say, we are going to adopt these standards as of this date, but we are going to allow a period of time to get, for the employers to get fully compliant. Does that make sense to you?
As long as they understand that they have to maintain the current standards until they've, so for instance, if that machinery that they don't want to replace to bring to 1910 breaks, they're going to have to repair it at least to current standards and operate it under current standards until the grandfathering period is over. So we don't want to create a misunderstanding where they think they have a free-for-all until that grandfather period is over. That would be our concern.
Okay. Yep.
So instead of removing the old standards, could we just maybe have language in there that says that there's going to be a minimum standard and then there's going to be an OSHA standard effective 2025? But they need to maintain the minimum standard now, and in 2025 there'll be an enhanced standard. Just like when we pass new building codes, and when we pass this or that, this is coming in 2025. You have to have certain things, or a fire code, or electrical code, stuff like that we're updating. Could we do that same thing here? There's a minimum standard that we're going to keep in place until we have the enhanced standard. Would that be helpful instead of just wiping everything out and then bringing 1910 in as a hammer?
I think it can kind of cut both ways. I mean, to your point, I think it could be helpful in that, of course, we're maintaining the current standards and informing all the stakeholders that this is what's coming down. To the other point that's kind of been discussed today, though, depending on how it's implemented, I could see parts of it being confusing. If people are looking at one and say, okay, I see there's, in essence, two different standards for ladders. Of course, our current standards say are basically the same to a point, and the OSHA standards are more robust. Again, it could just cause a little bit of confusion. So, I mean, it really boils down to how that's actually implemented. I think that is potentially feasible, but mechanically and procedurally, how that goes will be key there, I would say.
Thank you. And just a follow-up, Mr. Chairman. So what would prevent you today from going back to your office, implementing a new ladder standard, sending that over to GELCAR in your 1400 and getting it done without our intrusion?
Nothing would specifically, and never has, hindered that per se. Obviously, with the last couple of years with these discussions, of course, it's kind of been back and forth of where these would really go if they're statutory law versus administrative rules. But yes, to your point, we are able to do that. Obviously, as I'm sure the committee is aware, that if we were to say try and do the whole of 1910s in our administrative rules, that would be a very, very lengthy process with JLCAR because, they have to go through line by line. Even if we say this is carbon copied from OSHA, they nonetheless have to still go through it line by line.
Which is the reason why Deputy Commissioner Ogden said it would be more effective simply reference 1910 rather than trying to adopt piece by piece by piece by piece. And there are sections of it that are irrelevant to public sector employers in New Hampshire, but you adopt the whole thing and you use the pieces that are relevant. And again, relevant to different employers. But I guess I hear what you're saying about maintaining the old standards while moving towards the new standards. I'm not sure how you put that into the bill, and it would be confusing to have two different standards in place at the same time. And would it be feasible to simply reference current standards? Say OSHA standards are the one in place, and they will be fully implemented by X date. They're adopted as of this date, fully implemented some period of time down the road, a couple years later. And in the meantime, employers will be expected to maintain at least the current level of safety.
So we're talking about the difference between an effective date and something actually in the bill that's stating when some sort of grandfather of any machinery.
Right.
I mean, I think we can handle it the same as we do with an effective date, where it just states, until the such time, within I think you're talking about a 5-year grace period or a grandfather or 3-year. So, machinery that is currently up to code with respect to the can maintain the 1400 lab rules as of X date until such time until the 3 years is up, something to that degree.
Okay.
Just another idea.
Let's go. Go ahead.
So one of the things I'm concerned about is capacity. You currently have an obligation to review, an employee has an obligation every 2 years to look at their plan and revise their plan, and you have an obligation to make sure that's happening. So
Correct.
that, based on the number of employers in the state, is a big lift. So that's number one. Number two, when was the last time that there was a wholesale, revision of the lab rules relative to safety and health? Because you talk about big gaps currently that exist in the current lab rules. So when was the last time they did a wholesale kind of?
So it has not been wholesale, but just this past a few months ago, we did revise our 600 rules, review them, and update them. The plan is to do the 1400 rules, like, is going to be revised this year. So we do review them. So under Commissioner Merrifield, he does have us all on a schedule to look at our lab rules and review them annually. So we have done that for the 600s, and the next plan is to do that for the 1400s.
I'm having a little trouble hearing you because
Sorry, so
the air
we just
conditioning.
reviewed we just reviewed our 600 lab rules, and then we're going to be reviewing our 1400 lab rules. There was some discussion about whether or not it would be impacted by this bill, and whether we should tackle them or not. That's the only thing that's, I think, that's why we did the 600 first. But then the plan was to go over the 1400. So we do review them annually.
And what do you, if I could, what is the guidance that you use when you're revising a lab rule? What is the standard that you target yourself towards?
So we look at what our current, we look at our case studies. Is there something that's causing confusion? Is there something that is routinely not being adhered to, and why? We try to address that with our, revisions of our rules.
As an attorney, discretionary enforcement, I was an inspector for years in the city of Manchester. We were guided by zoning ordinances, the fire rules, all of those kinds of things. Workers' comp is guided by the law. What I'm hearing you say in some cases is that it is a discretionary situation where you interpret things based on your experience and all of those kinds of things that come together. And I understand that. So, but there is a gap, though. Would you agree that without a proper standard, there potentially could be a gap in the way that the way that you interpret things? And you go from one inspector to the other inspector to another inspector without a good standard, the possibility for discretionary enforcement, would you agree that that's a potential?
There's so during the course of an inspection you're talking about?
I'm talking about one, you take, what do you have, 3 or 4 inspectors, I think?
I have 2 currently with 1 opening. It's been open for a while.
Let's get them filled.
I am trying.
So,
And
but
I
I
also
mean,
have a DAS is here, so I'll be talking to them about one of the positions that I have open.
so you have, I mean, in the case of comp, you have case law, you have the law on the books, you have all these kinds of things that enter into how decisions are made. So the question I have is if absent a standard like OSHA or some other national standard, how do you overcome that potentially discretionary enforcement?
So there is a reasonable standard that we need to maintain. So a person can challenge my inspector's, position, which again I review. And if they can challenge it and it goes to the superior court review. So that's where the justification, sometimes we do lean on OSHA to support why our position is reasonable. And we try to tack it on to either the facts and circumstances of the case, where, it was reasonable for us to say you need to implement the training, your safety program as you wrote it. Because that person was not taught was not taught to utilize directional, so you're not enforcing your safety program, or they were taught and you're not disciplining them for not using it. So the facts will either support our reasonable corrective action plan, or we can rely on what is generally done within that industry standard as reasonable. So there is that check of the court that we, so that's why we do we're not, during COVID, a hazmat suit would have been the most effective way to protect someone. But is that reasonable? So, so that's something that would allowed us we had to do research to figure out how close to those lines can we get and uphold the reasonable standards in a court of law.
One issue that came up here that I think is worthwhile discussing. There are standards that currently exist for prisons, for nursing homes. In fact, OSHA doesn't cover some of these. OSHA doesn't cover prisons. It's a separate standard. So when we talk about enforcing OSHA standards for the prisons, it's a different standard. Firefighters have a whole different, so as we talk through this, how we accommodate those differences, something we need to talk about. Because if we were to drop the OSHA standard on, there's going to be all these gaps that are not going to apply.
So currently what we do in those issues, again, we have this reasonableness. And so when we talk about how our inspectors are not trained specifically to OSHA, you really have to look at them as more like expert researchers trying to figure. So we do, again, inspect, serious bodily injuries to firefighters, more frequently than we would like. But that's just the nature of the job, unfortunately. And when we look at that, we are looking at the fire standards. Are they adhering to the training? So we're not looking at OSHA. We're not looking at our own laws per se. We're looking at the other laws from the outside jurisdictions, and are those being upheld?
Okay, and the only final thing I would say is that the beneficiaries of good safety programs are the communities and other people, the businesses and the communities and stuff. And I'm really surprised that the insurance industry is not here, because they were here initially when we started talking about safety standards, and they have been the beneficiaries. In fact, a more recent article by Betancourt shows a significant slope in terms of cost savings for employers. So they've been the beneficiaries of safety and health programs and other things over the course of the years, and stuff that we negotiated with them some years ago. So I'm surprised they're not here saying that we would perhaps like better enforcement, better laws to help with providing safety. And finally, slips and falls account for thousands of injuries in New Hampshire, by your own numbers. Thousands, over 10,000 slips and falls alone were reported in your biennial report. And we should see another biennial report soon, correct? One's coming out in October. October 1st it's due.
I believe that that is correct, Representative. I know it is forthcoming at a minimum, though. It's been worked on for some time.
Do you have any sense of how much money will be turned back to the state of New Hampshire?
For the general fund give
Yeah.
back, I believe, and this is just off the top of my head, just memory, I believe it was close to 3 million for the last fiscal year. Obviously, we're in the infancy of the new fiscal year, so hard to tell of like any sort of projections. And I would have no reason to talk to our accounting bureau at this juncture for that. But I believe that it was a shade under 3 million was the give back to the general fund in the last fiscal year from the Department
That's
of
up
Labor.
from 2 million the last finance report.
Correct, correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sorry, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hearing some of the discussion we just had was, could there be an adoption date for 1910? Could there be an effective date for 1910? And could there be an enforcement date for 1910? Could those be utilized to get where we want to be? Could we say we're going to adopt them in 25? They'll become effective in 26, and we're going to start enforcing them in 27? Is that something that we would be able to do as legislators to do that for you guys? Or is it something that you would not want us to do because it would tie your hands for effective dates or enforcement dates? It would also give you guys, obviously the department, enough time to say, okay, yeah, they're dropping this in our lap in 25. We're going to have to, effective it in 26, and we're going to have to start enforcing it in 27. That also gives you 3 years to notify the 200 municipalities that you oversee or things like that to get that ball rolling in 25 or 24 or whatever.
I would say on its face, it definitely sounds like a feasible implementation schedule. Caveat being that obviously Director Rojas and I can't speak to certain aspects of that, when we're talking funding, things that are the commissioner level type things. So again, on its face, I think that that would be feasible potentially. And again, it all goes back to mechanically and procedurally how this actually is implemented. But a schedule like that, I think, would be feasible. Like boots on the ground, for the inspectors and for what we would need to do for finding, new consultants, establishing that program. But again, there's other pieces there that could impact that answer as well.
Yes.
That would also give you the ability to say, okay, well, we have these standards. This is what we need to enforce them. We need 2 more inspectors. We need another support person. We need an assistant commissioner, another assistant commissioner for that area to enforce that. Could that be part of the, I don't want to say enforcement mechanism, but could that be self-sufficient to the point where you could say, okay, we need 3 more employees. We give back $3 million. We need to withhold 400,000 out of that to keep these 3 employees.
Yeah, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think that, that could be helpful for us in the sense that obviously we can do analysis, but it's a guess at the end of the day until we start implementing, at least to a point of what the department would need for, more funding, well, not funding rather, because again, as it's been stated, we give back to the general fund, but for more positions, where the give back would end up be projection wise and everything. So we could kind of reevaluate and say, yeah, we came here, we said that we need X amount of positions of consultants. Given the volume of stakeholders that have come to the department, we now realize we need Y amount, which is an increase. So I think that could be helpful in that sense. Again, just the standard caveat being that there's, positions and pieces of that frankly, we're just not privy to in our positions.
The last follow-up, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
And I can certainly understand all that. There's a lot of open-ended questions that we have today that we've been working towards closing the gap in this legislation, get it through, and then get it over to the Senate. If we did slow walk it, which through the implementation process, what support would you want from us to say, okay, well, we can't do this in a year. Can we adjust this date? Would you want to come back to us and have us do another amendment? Or would you rather have this law saying this is what we're going to do, get it done by this time, or we're going to be filing this? Is it something that we can just trying to find a happy medium so everybody's happy here.
Yeah, and I would say, yeah, communication is always key with these things because, the last thing any of us would want is, we kind of have a general agreement and then 3 years down the line, we have to come here and testify and say, yeah, this isn't working out for anybody. Um, so again, hard to say on its face right now, but I think it would obviously be helpful if it's kind of if it's something that as we're going through, if we are going to do a slow walk implementation, that it's a coordination between us and the legislature in, us updating you guys to say this is where we're at, this is what we're seeing, and trying to get ahead of potential issues in the future.
Then how I also envision our audits, if you do a slow walk process, our audits would be kind of done under each category. So what it looks like so we can help the towns and the counties plan. You're in current compliance with X, but please note that when we go into the next one, these are the things you're going to be needing to plan to address. And then by the time we get to the final stage, this is what we're going to be looking for, so that they can also project. And as we get feedback from the towns with the various, issues that they're presenting for why that would not be possible, we could bring that back to you.
And I'm attracted to what Representative Avalani is suggesting. And I guess I'm going to say again that I think we need guidance from the department as exactly how that would best work. You know, I'm not sure what the difference between adopting and effective date is, but essentially, it's not a bad idea to say, okay, we are making a commitment that these are going to be our standards. We're going to, and frankly, the repeal date would be delayed as well. You would leave the current standards in place. You would commit to the OSHA standards, give time for everybody to get ready, the department, the employers, everyone has a gap in time, but the law says we're going here. And this is the date when we're going to be there. If you could work on that so that we can put that into an amendment, I think that would be helpful for everybody. It would reduce a lot of the anxiety around this.
Mr. Chairman, I have just one comment about just a little housekeeping of the bill. If you look at the original bill that was filed, it talks about implementing 1910 letter D through Z with the exception of U. So I have the outline of what A through Z is. And U that you want excluded is COVID-19 items. V, W, X, and Y are reserved, and there's nothing there. So I think we should probably have that rewritten to D through whatever T, and then part Z, because I don't want to implement something here, part V through Y, which has nothing there and could be just,
Attorney Gardner, do you recall what that reserved section is?
I think it is literally just reserved for when OSHA if they choose to implement an entirely new standard, you're not adding to, we want ladders or scaffolding to be a little bit more safe. There's some new things where they say, and I would say, I don't know historically, but my guess is subpart U up until 2020 was probably reserved. So I think it's for scenarios like that. So they're not kind of adding on ZZ, AA, and they just have, A through Z. So in that sense, that's how I understand it to be reserved. It's not something I've researched by any means, but I think that's really all it is at the end of the day.
And it's subpart, Representative Infantine is pointing out subpart C is also reserved. Is that probably something that was repealed at some point?
Again, it's not something that I've researched by any means. My guess, just speculatively, would be that they probably intended to have one of the initial subparts reserved just in case they needed to do what I would consider more like housekeeping definition sections, something along those lines. So you're not adding something that really should be at the start of a law into like subpart Z or somewhere there. So it's like up front, people can actually see it. Again, that's just a speculative guess, though.
Your bill excludes section A through D. Section A through C. It only takes letters D through Z. So I don't want to put something in there that we have to follow W, X, and Y.
Right.
When we don't know what they are yet, what they could be someday. That's all.
Right. Okay. Anything else from the committee? I guess I would ask that you folks send an email to Representative Infantine and myself suggesting a date to get together next week, the time and date. And my schedule is reasonably open after Monday. I don't know what your schedule is.
Depends on any given day, I'm sorry
Okay.
to say.
Okay, if you could just make a suggestion or a couple of suggestions as to when we might get together, hopefully we can iron some of this stuff out on the side and then bring it back to this group. And I guess I would suggest that we will not meet next week, but would meet the following week to put that together. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're adjourned.
I don't want to put Tyler on the spot, but at some point I would like to hear from the firefighters relative to how OSHA and the national standards for the governed firefighters, how those integrate. And I don't expect you to answer that now. I would suspect that, there's not a standard in the fire station for the stairs being slippery. It's not under OSHA, it's not under, current NFPA standards, but, so I'd be interested to hear how those, and if there's anything as we draft this, as it relates to firefighters or prisons or other nursing homes, if there is something that we should take into consideration to do that. Thank you.